Thank you for tuning in to the Practical Preservation Podcast. Please take a moment to visit our website, practicalpreservationservices.com, for additional information and tips to help you restore your historical home. If you've not done so, please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, and also like us on Facebook. Welcome to the Practical Preservation Podcast, hosted by Danielle and Jonathan Kepperling. Kepperling Preservation Services is a family-owned business based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, dedicated to the preservation of our built architectural history for today's use as well as future generations. Our weekly podcast provides you with expert advice specific to the unique needs of renovating a historic home, educating by sharing our From the Trenches preservation knowledge and our guests' expertise, balancing modern needs while maintaining the historical significance, character, and beauty of your period home.
Today on the Practical Preservation Podcast, we have Bruce with us from the Lebanon County Historical Society. Thank you for joining us.
Sure.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your background.
Going way back, I actually grew up on a farm and always, from very young, had an interest in not just history, but material culture, which is the artifacts, old books, old paper, old bottles. It's basically, when you're young, if you collect anything, your collection isn't too refined as yet, so you're very broad.
Yes.
You're very broad in your interests, and then as you become older, you understand lots of things like the technology behind how things were made, and then provenance, the history of something, is it associated with anybody that matters to you, and so your collecting becomes more sophisticated as you mature, and just even I guess as a kid had a goal to work in a museum, and but in local colleges and universities, and this would be in the 1970s, unless you were going to go to a special program. There wasn't so much available on museum studies and public history back then. So I went with a straight bachelor's degree in American history, and then the same thing with a master's degree, but then specialized in colonial. But during my undergraduate time, I was able to pick up two very valuable internships with the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission. The first one that I did was, in fact, in historic preservation, and I worked on a National Register nomination as my project for what's known, people know it now as the Renaissance Fair, but in fact it was the Mount Hope iron furnace.
Oh, okay.
And what a lot of people don't know is that under separate ownership back there in the woods on the other side of the turnpike is the original Mount Hope furnace stack and the charcoal house and other associated buildings.
I did not know that. That's very cool.
And so anyway, I got that going, or got that drafted, and then professional staff later finished that off. And then about 1980 or so, I had an internship in the section of archaeology. And so as I was starting to think about getting into a career in museum work or public history, the route that I took, and interns often ask me, gee, what should I do? Well, the route that I took was to be very broad.
Right.
So I had the Bachelor of Arts in History, and then got a master's in history with a minor in art history. So I thought, okay, now I've got the academic history, and I've got a little bit of archaeology, and I've got some historic preservation, I get some art history under my belt, and then I took a course in archival management too.
Oh, yes.
So that's what I was taking, this very very broad approach, and my first job then with the Museum Commission was in historic preservation.
Okay. And did you manage sites, or what did you do with
No,
it within
like,
preservation?
If you compare the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office to, say, the National Park Service, which would be the federal version, the folks in the Park Service always like to say that they have their in-house programs and their out-house programs. So the in-house programs in the NPS are the sites that they own and that they manage and they administer, and then their out-house or out-of-house programs are things like the National Register, National Historic Landmark Program, and things where the National Park Service interfaces with the public,
the state.
with other programs
their
that are
entities,
outside of what they directly manage.
Yeah.
So same thing with the Historical Museum Commission. They had a bureau, and they've changed their organization over the years. But at one time, and most of the time that I worked there, they had a bureau of historic sites and museums, and those were our own satellite museums. Everything from the State Museum to Landis Valley to Ephrata Cloister to Cornwall Iron Furnace, just to name some of the ones that are more local.
Right.
And what I did, however, is I worked in what you could call the outhouse programs. And for what I did for most of the time, when I first started, I did a lot of what we called environmental review. And that was looking at any kind of project that had state or federal funding, grants, or licensing, and assess the impact on historic resources.
Right.
So, if, for example, there was a project one time in just as an example, in McKeesport, where they severely depressed at that point in the 1980s, and they were looking to demolish. I think it was like 300 houses.
Oh my goodness!
Because they had so much vacant housing stock, and a lot of these were in good repair.
Yeah. But
the market had plummeted. So I did those kinds of assessments, and then gradually, as I got more experience, I was given more and more projects to actually review the plans and specifications. So, and at the same time, we had a bit of trouble keeping a preservation architect, which is a very highly valued skill set. Not necessarily a registered architect, but somebody who has at least an MArch or a master's in architecture,
right,
and then has it. So a lot of times I had to really fill in to keep projects moving, because Pennsylvania had an immense amount of materials coming in, not just the environmental reviews, but there was Economic Recovery Tax Act, or the tax credits for certified historic rehabilitation. And I ended up spending most of my time
reviewing
those kinds of plans and specifications. And so I still know, even though I'm out of that, probably that business, 30 some years, 25 to 30 some years, I still know that if you're cleaning a building, you don't use more than 600 pounds per square inch of pressure at 4 gallons of flow rate at the nozzle, and how to make the recipe for a high-line mortar and those kinds of things. So,
well, and those are the things that are important, that are going to not cause irreversible damage to the building.
Right, and that whole principle of irreversibility is something, whether you're a conservator of paper or paintings, or you're a curator, whether you're looking at a building or you're looking at an artifact, a piece of paper, that it's almost like the Hippocratic oath for a doctor: do no harm.
Right.
You do nothing that can't be reversed.
That's true.
Unless it absolutely needs to be done to stay to, if the piece is in imminent danger of collapse or disintegration, and sometimes you have to
do a big intervention. So what what drew you into preservation? Was it your internship? Or had you already kind of decided that was the direction you wanted to go?
Yes, actually the very first thing that I did in my very first internship was there was a very early log house down toward Philadelphia. I think it was in Upper Darby. Upper Darby Township, and it was reputed to be a Swedish.
I think I've read about that.
A Swedish log
Yeah.
house. And matter of fact, there were two of them there. There was the upper cabin and the lower cabin. And some people thought they dated to the 1600s, and
Right.
some of them thought they dated to the 1700s. And well, this was my first project as my first public history internship. And the person who was my mentor handed me all this correspondence and material and said, see what you think about this and make an assessment out of it. And what I found was that a lot of people were spinning their wheels, I thought, just as a new pair of eyes.
Right.
A lot of people were spinning their wheels and wasting a lot of their time trying to figure out if this little log house was Swedish or Finnish. It could have been Finnish because there were actually more Finns in some of these parts
Yes.
than Swedes, or whether it was Germanic, whether it dated to the 1660s or whether it dated to the 1720s to 50s.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, the site was not very well guarded or protected, and so it was being vandalized while people were arguing about its ethnicity and
Right.
its age and
Right.
its different attributes.
Yeah.
And which I thought was a real shame. That was the
That-
one lesson
yeah,
I
yeah.
kind of
Well,
took from that.
and really in the whole scheme of things, I mean, it's nice to be able to like pinpoint a date or pinpoint, who built it. But when you're looking at a time period where there were no records, there was no building permit. I don't think that there would be a big difference between the late 1600s and the early 1700s for a log building.
And they were looking at things like a Scandinavian attribute would
Right.
be a corner fireplace, and a German attribute would be full dovetail corner notching,
Right.
and things like that.
Yeah.
And and I said, well, gee, we could have had a Swedish woman who married a German, and she said, we'll build this the way you like it, but I've got to have a corner
Right,
fireplace.
right.
And right there would have been.
Yeah, the answer. But nobody knows.
amazing.
Nobody had the answer.
So,
Yeah.
and it did much later. It contributed to my initial interest in log buildings, and then much later, not too much later, is in the big sense of time, but about 1991, then I drafted a technical bulletin for the National Park Service on the restoration and repair of historic log buildings.
One of the
One of the preservation brief series.
preservation, yeah.
And I was pretty proud of it at the time, and I still am, because it was, at that point, it was the longest technical bulletin in that series. And it was the first one that was conceived in a state office rather than in the National Park Service,
Right.
and essentially written in a state office. Now, of course, the NPS, it was their publication, so they had to have the last word on editing, and
Right.
so there were photographs that I wanted to use that didn't get used. And initially, in those days when I worked there, I mean, not everybody had a computer on their desk.
Oh, yeah. That
And
would have been
If you
early.
wanted to order any of the preservation briefs, you wrote to the U.S. Government Printing Office, and for like $1 a piece, you could get these.
Yeah.
And the NPS shipped these out essentially free to all of the different state offices, and we could distribute them. But what I found, or what initiated that, was at that point I had a very experienced preservation architect that I was working with.
Oh, yes.
And he had worked for the National Park Service some time before, and at that point there were already 20 some of these technical briefs, and I often took calls in the office where somebody would call for assistance, and they'd say, can you give me some advice? I'm restoring a log house or restoring a log cabin. And we'd start talking about this, and not too far into the conversation, I might find out that all they really had were a bunch of salvaged logs in the back of a tractor trailer.
Oh my goodness.
Or in a shed. So, and I'm not saying that sometimes isn't the only way to save all that can be saved, but too often people thought that the whole history and significance was inherent in the logs alone.
Right.
And so everything else, the interior trim, fireplace mantles, and everything got thrown away.
Right.
Just to try and save the logs, and sometimes these were already taken up and moved without necessarily any numbering or photographs or any prior documentation.
Right.
And so they had this big jigsaw puzzle of a large, severely compromised artifact.
Right.
And I said to my supervisor one day, I said, the Park Service is doing all these preservation briefs, and they've gotten to some really fine points of preservation. They were doing historic storefronts,
right,
all kinds of things. I said, but nobody has written one on this very basic wall and structural system of logs.
Yeah.
And with his prior background and context that we had in the parks, he said, why don't you write one? He said, go ahead, and he said, I'll talk up the chain about the idea, and you draft one, and we'll send it in and see if they salute.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And it worked out.
Yeah, I know we've restored a few logs, and the one in Elizabethtown, when you said fireplace, it made me think of it. We found the mantle had been like covered up and built into the wall, so we found the mantle there. But yeah, typically, people are more worried about the logs than the rest of it. Yes. So, tell me about the Lebanon County Historical Society. Tell me a little bit about the history.
Well, this historical society was established in 1898, and like a lot of county historical societies, early on when they were established, and you can well imagine that some of the earlier counties with a larger population, and certainly those that have ones that have maybe institutions of higher learning or have more of a critical mass of people looking to preserve certain things from their community of county maybe got established first. But by and large, just generally speaking, county historical societies were often places where men, whether they were doctors or leaders in their community or businessmen, put together or wrote papers, and they read them in a very formal style in some kind of an auditorium to the other members of the society, and then generally they were typed up and they were printed in their papers.
Yeah. Were they like things that they had researched, or were they like their memoirs, or what were they writing about?
It was quite a range. Some of them, in some cases, were very proud of, say, their own lineage, and they had the papers of on their own family. Right. And they could say, well, this is a little bit about the so-and-so family. And they could talk about when their progenitor came over, perhaps from Europe, and where he settled and what land he bought, and on and on. But there were some that were, I think, generally concerned about knowledge being lost. Right. Local history and local knowledge. And they wanted to convey, what they could, or maybe they had the only photographs of a certain thing, and felt that there was a side to some property or some thing that they wanted to tell this story. And so they were kind of like a lot of, in a way, like a lot of the other popular fraternal organizations of that time period, when fraternal organizations were very popular,
Right.
whether it was the Elks, the Moose, the Oddfellows, the Patriotic Order, Sons of America, or whatever. There were a lot of them.
Yes.
And in some ways, it was like another one of those, except their interests were really keyed on history and on local history or area or regional history. And I think another generalization that you sometimes see is you, over time, you might get a contingent within the formation of an early historical society, true much later, usually well into the 20th century, where you get a contingent that gets interested in preserving buildings. And they say, well, what can we do beyond just saying, please don't tear it down, please don't. And so sometimes you would see historical societies buying other historic buildings, or trying to create some kind of revolving fund,
Right.
or trying to raise money to actually save buildings. And sometimes this has been good in terms of bringing other people into the historical society, and sometimes it tore some of these historical societies apart.
Sure.
Where they said, well, gee, we're just doing history, and now you've got us, raising all this money for some
Right.
building and making repairs, and it's taking all of
Right.
our money. All of our money is going into...
Yeah, and I've heard of one museum, I can't even remember who it was, one museum person years ago was like, well, there's, two types of like historical groups. There's like the ones that are focused on preserving buildings and the ones that are like focused on people.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good generalization. And, and to apply that to our situation right here, this historical society was not initially in this building, and the front building was used for some of the very first court cases in the county.
Okay. Yeah, it's beautiful.
When the county, and it's an 18th century building,
Yes,
that front part.
Yeah.
And so the Historical Society, when this became available, and this auditorium that we're in right now, this big auditorium with the balcony and the other floors and everything, is the result of another fraternity, the Moose, the Loyal Order of Moose, built this. They added this auditorium onto the back of that 18th century building. And they had a sauna upstairs, they had a bowling alley down below, and the smoking area. They had a bar. Yeah. The room that we walked through, the library, the reading room, was the bar.
Oh my goodness!
Of the social club. So they had all these various amenities, and so some of these things made it great for the Historical Society to take over.
It actually gave you a great space.
We have a lecture space, and we have all this other space. The other thing that's very important to mention in terms of preserving structures is that the Lebanon County Historical Society also owns the oldest transportation tunnel in America, which is the Union Canal Tunnel.
Okay, yes.
And that dates back to the 1820s. And
I saw that on the website when I was prepping for this, that you have probably not right now, but that you have tours that take you on a boat through there. Yeah.
And then an annual event in May, Canal Days.
Okay.
And so we have some boats or canal barges, if you will, that are not old, but modern built, that we can actually take people through the tunnel.
Oh yeah.
And they can talk about the construction of the canal and of the tunnel and of the geology of the hill that the tunnel goes underneath. And the Historical Society is also responsible for having stabilized and rebuilt the collapsed north portal of the canal tunnel. Stones had basically fallen down into
the mortar.
So they cleared out and dredged, so that
cool.
we can and developed a park on the other side, and as a result of some generous donations, including a very important one from Hershey Corporation of land, the Historical Society owns about 100 acres.
Oh, that's
out
huge.
There. That is the Union Canal Tunnel. Park.
And then do you rent space there, or does it generate some revenue for you then too?
That's something that will be increased in the future.
Okay,
That's something
okay.
that
No,
we'll-
I was thinking it's a great resource to be able to utilize.
And we moved. And speaking of
Yeah.
of logs,
Yeah.
the Historical Society also took over a project to rebuild an old log barn.
Oh, very cool.
And that was a case where the logs of the barn had to go,
Oh.
and another group was working on that. So that's something they picked up midstream and are to this day still carrying that to fruition.
Okay.
So that has been, in that case, all those logs were carefully marked and they've all been gotten back in place. It's like I think 1790s or so.
Oh, yeah. You don't see many log barns. I think most probably because they were used so hard that the logs didn't, the construction didn't stay. Okay, well, I know that right now you probably have a pause on your events, but tell me about some of the events that you do have, and some of the things that you do to reach out to the community.
Well, we have a Sunday lecture series, and we've unfortunately had to put that on hold. And those lectures are given in this auditorium, in this space that we're in now, which is a great room for it.
Oh, yes.
The stage up there actually has if you look above the colonial theater sign, you'll see a seam in the front elevation, and there's actually a motor under that stage, a motor with a belt, and a lower stage. If you
will it
switch,
pull out?
It will come out.
Oh, very cool.
It will.
So you have like
motor
two
on
layers.
Right, two layered stage that will project even closer to the audience.
Very cool. I will take a picture of that and make sure that we put it up with the podcast so everybody can get the visual of that. That's really, I don't think I've ever seen that, but that's fun. That's something fun. So and then you have the library here. So do people send you like requests for genealogy research and things like that, or do people mostly come in?
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is most of what that is the office manager and I as the archivist librarian are engaged in handling that. And we get a surprising number of out-of-state requests. A lot of families emanated from Pennsylvania.
Right.
Not only did we have Philadelphia as one of the major ports, but a lot of people, of course, of German or Germanic descent came this way through Pennsylvania. And so you have a lot of people out there across America that trace their heritage back to Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And with this whole COVID business going on, as people were cooped up,
they had time.
Genealogy was already becoming very popular again, and it has, if anything, surged as people were pent up with their family. And of course, there were some good things that came out of that, getting to spend some quality time with your family, but also getting to spend even more time with your computer. So we have a lot of people who are going online, going to various sites. I won't go through and name a whole lot of them, but of course there are lots of sites where you can find help.
Oh, yes.
Now, as far as you're doing your own genealogy. So there, I think, was an even greater pent-up demand. And so we were closed because of COVID from mid-March to mid-August.
Yeah, that's a long. Yeah.
And I came in from time to time to keep my email under control and to check on things like dehumidifiers and just security. And all of that. So we're still digging out from a backlog of requests, but of the paid, the prepaid requests, if somebody wants to come here and do research in our library and archives. The cost is $8 a day. It was $6. We just recently raised it $2. And it is still a tremendous bargain because that it unfortunately doesn't get you a parking space. That's the downside. But it does give you all day if you want it here, or at least when we're open from 10 to 5, to use our library and to use our database. If it's archival matter, I need to pull it out,
Right.
put it in front of you. But otherwise, our library, you can use that like you would use another library. And that also gives you free Wi-Fi, and it gives you access to an expanded subscription to things like, I said I wasn't going to mention some of these, but like Ancestry and newspapers.com.
Oh, yeah.
You're going to be able to see and access more newspapers through our the library level subscription that we have than likely with your home subscription. And then we've got many of the old newspapers themselves. We have them on microfilm too. We've got a tremendous wealth, just to generally tell you what we've got here, of manuscripts, architectural drawings and plans, deeds, postcards, a very large postcard collection, a very large photograph collection. And I'm just talking, and then other church and cemetery records, as far as births and marriages and those kinds of things. And I'm just talking about the two-dimensional artifacts.
Right.
now.
Yes.
I'm talking about the things that are mostly have a length and a width.
Yes.
The three-dimensional artifacts are what occupy the rest of the building and is basically the museum of artifacts here. And you can see a reconstructed pharmacy, a barber shop, and some of these are whole vignettes or scenarios of things taken right out of a particular room.
Oh, very cool. Yes.
So it's not just something that's been composed.
Yes.
It's
It's yeah, you like you set it up exactly how it was wherever it came out of.
right.
Yeah. Let me think. So you have information not just genealogy related, but also like if somebody was interested in the history of their house or their building, they could also reach out to you, or
Yes.
at least it's some you
Yeah.
have some things, since
Yeah.
you said you had some blueprints and things like that, deeds.
And of course, it depends on who lived there,
Right.
that sort of thing. So we will sometimes have people be disappointed that we won't have much on their house that might be a row house in town. But what I tell them is, go to the county courthouse and get a chain of title
Right.
and find out who did live there. Because then once you have those names, you can come back to us and we can use city directories, we can use other records to find out who those people were, census records,
Right.
find out who those people were, what they did, how long they lived there, what their, if you really want to learn about the people that lived in your house.
Right.
I think we can find you something.
Yeah.
And I should also, before we go on, mention that some of my background, matter of fact, a larger part of my background, was as a curator at the Landis Valley Village and Farm Museum in Lancaster County. And I did that for almost 2.5 decades, was a curator down there with a very large collection that
they have a
included
huge
manuscripts
collection, yeah.
and family Bibles and things like that,
Yeah.
but also include things like steam engines and an enormous tool collection.
Farm stuff.
So yes, and then also agricultural technology and rural,
Yeah.
all kinds of rural artifacts.
That's And Landis Valley is beautiful. I recommend. Well, I don't. They're not open. So I was gonna say I recommend it for a day trip, but they're not open. So I know that you had to close for an extended period of time. What other challenges are you finding? Running a nonprofit in the age that we're in.
Well, you have this is an issue for any museum, and not necessarily even a nonprofit.
Right.
Is that you always have to remember that you have not only finite resources, but finite space. And so, really, every museum or historical society out there needs to have a mission that they try to adhere to in terms of what they collect.
I think that's excellent advice.
And if you're a county historical society, the simplest thing is, well, it needs to be something that was made here,
right,
or used here, or made some kind of history, attached to the county. So oftentimes that's when, if somebody calls you and says, I've got something that I want to donate, and by far, all the places that I worked, most of the things that you add to the collection were by donation.
Right.
And there are some wonderful things out there, because things that have been in people's families, and maybe they can no longer care for them, or a younger generation doesn't want them.
Right.
Or whatever the case might be, they call a museum or historical organization that makes sense to them. And when they offer something for donation, one of your first questions needs to be, where did this come from? Because if they say, well, gee, we went to the shore last year and we always like stopping at such and such a flea market.
Oh, goodness.
In Jersey before we get down to the shore, and well, unless it's marked Lebanon County,
right,
or somehow that it has. So anyway, that's something that all historical organizations. And as far as a nonprofit, not only you have to raise money,
right,
and not only do we have things like the canal days and events associated with the canal, but we have, of course, membership.
right,
And membership it's not huge, and we have a lot of bills to pay. We have had for some time an annual a ball, fundraising ball, and that's been held at the Lebanon Country Club the last so many years. And all museums that I've worked with, I haven't worked with a lot of museums, but I've put in a lot of years in the museums that I have worked in,
right,
are heavily dependent upon volunteer work. Heavily dependent on volunteer work. And at Landis Valley, I was really fortunate to have a number of, and in a lot of cases, these are retired folks, because they're the ones that have this time to devote. But at Landis Valley, I was very fortunate to have a number of professional folks who all along had historical interests.
yes,
One who was had in his professional life, for example, who had been a physicist, but knew a lot about postcards and had a postcard collection.
Oh.
Well, we had 10,000 some postcards
Yes.
down there that needed, and we've got several thousand postcards here too at the Historical Society. So finding people like that already know a lot about the historical subject, and often tend to be very conscientious in their treatment of, and we give them some guidance on handling things.
Right.
And there's some common sense things, some things you might not think of. If you're handling a stoneware, redware jug, don't just grab it by the handle.
Right.
You might think, well, gee, that's what the handle's made for. You don't want on an artifact, you don't want that handle coming off in your hand.
Oh my goodness, that would be a really bad day.
So you're going to have two hands. You're going to have a hand under the base, and you're going to have maybe the other hand is on the handle. But you're going to, and a lot of common sense things with books and old maps and architectural drawings and things that would be in the archive. So, we give people some training in that, but the volunteers are very important. And I found it interesting that I had about 5 volunteers down there, and of course that was a
Yes.
a state site, and you still need the volunteers really to help to get anything done. And had 5 of them there, and I came down here, and there were 5 of them here in the archives, and they had particular expertise here too. I found that one was especially interested in good at early church records and family records, and able to read Old German script. Another one had a background in medicine, so he was particularly knew about the medical records. And another one had a background in the land office at the courthouse.
Oh my goodness! Yeah,
So
you had like everybody you needed.
So and nonprofits just absolutely have to have volunteers, and then there are the interns if you're lucky enough to get them, and generally from college, but not always.
Right.
Sometimes from high school. When I started, not long after I started here, I had a high school. I don't know if you could call her an intern. Usually, I think of an intern as they have a specific project and they're getting a grade.
Right.
They're getting academic credit, and so you want to give them a succinct project. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then when they're done, they can put a bow on it, and they can feel like they've not just sort of moved the football another yard, but they've scored a touchdown with what they're
they've accomplished something.
What they're working on, and I, in my long public history career that's of almost 40 years, I've had about 30 interns over the years, and most of them have been good, and a few have been truly outstanding.
Yeah.
So, which makes it a lot easier for me to write letters of recommendation.
I completely understand. I had we had the program through Millersville where they actually get paid, but we don't have to pay them, and we get them for the summer. So it's great, but I had 3 this summer, and 2 were like excellent and the best, and then the one that was we had struggles. We made it through the summer, but we struggled some. She was the one that was like, "Can I use you for a reference?" And I'm like, "Well, let's talk about what struggles we had first. how you could do better."
Well, I was having been an intern myself twice. And when I finally did get my job in preservation, my supervisor much later said that you were one of 17 applicants for this position that all had pretty similar college training.
Yeah.
And were starting out, as far as experience, except we knew you.
Oh yeah, that makes a difference.
And so the internship is important for whether you go on to work for that same entity that you interned for or not. It does get people in that community of interest to get to know you, and it helps you to decide whether this is something you really want to do.
I agree.
And it also helps you figure out what aspects of it you do or don't want to do. You might think that you really, really, really want to be an archaeologist, and if you're exposed to the full breadth of what it means to work at in a archaeology division of a museum, you'll hopefully get some field work where you're out there in summer getting grubby and sweating in the trench and learning how to make straight profiles with a trowel, and learning that it's not just finding the goodies, but finding them in their relationship in the ground to each other at different depths. But that you'll also get to do back in the office or back in base, you'll get to sit down and look at the clean artifacts and begin to do some typology, which is being able to sort them according to time period and maybe what culture they came from, that sort of thing, get to do associated map work, get to do some of the paperwork that's the
Right.
follow-up to that documentation, get to photograph the pieces and describe them in a catalog description, so that describe them as, and this is a good exercise, succinctly, so that somebody, I mean, with a real economy of words, yet somebody in the next room who's never seen the artifact can come and look, see a pile of these and say, oh yeah, that's the one that's just been described to me, that's the one there.
Right.
And putting little white numbers on and doing all the other things that are related to archaeology or related to being a curator
Right.
or an archivist or whatever.
Yeah. Now,
So you might like certain aspects of that job and not like other aspects. And sometimes you can't avoid them. You take what you like with what you don't. But if you are offered an opportunity and you know that it's going to be all field work and it's going to be seasonal, or you're offered a job in a section of archaeology where you're doing the documentation, the photography, cleaning the artifacts in the lab, putting the little numbers on them, associating them with maps, and you're going to be doing very little field work, that might or might not be
what you want to do,
for you,
right?
or not.
Yeah.
And you learn what aspects of the job, and not just that, but pipe fitting or carpentry,
Right.
or whatever.
Anything. Yeah.
Learn, take an internship, find out what about the job, whether it's something you're going to like or.
Right. Yeah. Because sometimes it's not what you imagine it will be, and it's hard if you've already like invested a lot of time in preparing to be that.
Yeah.
But then I hope that someone would be able to then, make the adjustment and find something that they're happy with. Because I think that life is definitely too short to like be miserable going to work every day.
Right. You want to be, if not, whistling every day you go to work, you want to at least feel that you want to, if you can, if you're fortunate, to feel fulfilled in some way.
I agree.
And that extends to all kinds of jobs. I mean, some of it, it's just if people have produced a widget or they've filled so many drums, and they can go home feeling like they've exerted themselves physically.
Right.
I know for me, if I do all mental work and I don't get any physical work, I like to have. I mean, the ancient Greek ideal was that you be balanced in your mental and your physical. And I know for me, if I don't get enough of the physical in there, I'm depressed.
Well,
I love history and I love the old stuff.
Yeah.
But I have to get out.
And I think that is having a balanced life. And I know when I have to like use my brain all day, then I am really tired at night. So, what trends and challenges do you see in preservation based on your kind of vantage point?
You're talking about architectural preservation.
Yeah, or any type of preservation. I mean, you can take that however you want.
Boy, I don't know if I'm out there enough to see the trends. Certainly, I think. Well, let's look at what's popular now. Certainly, genealogy is going strong, and I think continues. And I think that's a good thing. And I have to be honest here. When I worked in other fields, sometimes I would get very irritated when people would come in to look at something and they were so fixated on an ancestor who was in a particular regiment.
Oh, yes.
And they wanted to tell you to the nth degree what he did and et cetera. And yet I've found, and it's a function of, I guess, my getting older and working also in a different kind of history environment. And what I said before about collecting and reaching a certain level of maturity, you do at some point really get interested in, especially in family articles that were passed down,
right? And
who had them and who used them and who might have made them. And so, whereas when I was much younger, I was really, content to collect certain kinds of tools or whatever.
Yes.
Now it's got to have a maker's mark on it, and I've got to know where, what township
Right.
did it come from at least, and if it didn't come from my family, I'd like to know
Yeah.
where it spent its life,
Right.
that sort of thing. So the genealogy, almost everybody, you can get interested in their own history.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a good thing, and we need to remember that history is it's really, we're not unearthing new facts that were never known, although we might be giving them new interpretations.
Right.
We're really, collectively, humanity is recalling what it has forgotten.
Right.
So there are things that you just wish you knew or could figure out that was just common knowledge to your great-great-grandma and great-great-grandpa.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That was just so commonplace that they didn't write it down or didn't say. And so now you might have something that's passed down to you that's like a hammer or something, and you just know it's passed down in the family, but you don't know if somebody did their apprenticeship with it or if it was their favorite tool as a maker of crates or whatever.
Right.
And you wish you knew these things.
Mm-hmm.
And when people are busy earning their living and everything, they don't have time to write
Right.
everything down. So anyway, I think it's good to see expanding interest in genealogy and expanding capabilities to answer people's questions on the internet. But you are going to have to be cautious because, as people keep telling people, not everything you see on the internet is necessarily true.
That's true.
And at the end of the day, you've got to go. I'll make a pitch for the Historical Society. You've got to go to the repository,
Yeah.
and you've got to see for yourself whose names are on the deed, whose names are on the birth certificate. Look at the census records, look at the newspapers, the marriage records, et cetera, and verify what you see on the internet.
Right.
And that's when everybody really truly becomes a historian. And I think that's a good thing. Shows like Antiques Roadshow.
Oh yeah.
That's something that's very popular. And as I've been telling people around me for a couple of years now, I think that one of the very best things that Antiques Roadshow has indirectly introduced is this whole idea of provenance. And that is, what is the history of a piece,
Right.
and where did it come from? Because I think that your layman out there, for the most part, pretty much thought that the value of something was inherent in just whatever it is. So if it's I keep using tools, but if it's give me another artifact. We've got quilts hanging all around
yes.
us there that you can't see. That it might be a fine example of a certain pattern of a quilt in terms of the condition of it, in terms of the complexity of it, the different colors that were used, just the way it was put together, and as I say, the condition or shape. And that's one level of interest and value. If you know beyond that it was made by a great-great-grandmother, that it was your great-great-grandmother, or it was the great-great-grandmother of somebody who's important in history,
Right.
who that makes it so much more, it gives it a higher monetary value,
Right.
but also makes it that much more interesting.
It has a story.
It has a story, and if you've seen photographs of that person, and when you see somebody who comes into Antiques Roadshow, and they come in and they have an artifact, and then they've got an associated letter
Yes.
where it was given to great-great-grandpa, and then they've got some other artifact, and so they've got paper documentation, and they've got an artifact, and they've got another related artifact, and they've got this whole story, and then the appraiser says, "Wow, I've never seen anything like this."
That is funny.
And they give their attention to
Yeah, yeah, they do, and I think they like to. I think they like to tell the stories also. I enjoy watching that show too.
So the moral of the story there is, if you know now about how much more interesting an artifact is, if it's got past documentation, if you've got something now in your family that's maybe not old,
Right.
and you know that it could well be of interest in the future, somewhere record where it came from.
Right.
And maybe of the most important 3 or 4 things that might be modern things that you're going to pass down, somehow preserve that story.
Right.
If it's a piece where you can write it on the back, or you can put it on something and put it in a drawer and also have a digital copy on the computer, do that. And then if you've got some old artifact that was maybe your grandfather's, and you knew your grandfather, and your grandfather not only gave it to you, but he told you a story, and that story's just been up in your head.
Right.
Make a digital copy of that, or write that down.
Yeah.
Because that's the sort of thing that, while you know it, and it's common knowledge, and you may have known it for 75 years,
Yeah.
your great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, if the piece stays in the family, are going to want to know that.
Right.
Or if they don't want the piece and it goes out on the market,
But
at
that can still
least
go with it. Yeah.
It's known, and
Yeah.
that story is preserved
Yeah.
with the piece.
Yeah. I think that's really important. I know that my husband's grandmother gives us a lot of things that have been, and so like now I'm thinking, I should probably like write some things down. We take good care of them, but we haven't done a lot of documentation. So, how can someone support the Lebanon County Historical Society? Is memberships the best way?
Well, obviously, if we get a donation over and above membership, that's ideal. But let me throw one other thing out.
Sure.
Is not just the monetary donation, but try and see what the younger generation is interested in, and because that gives us a future investment in it. In terms of, bring your kids here.
Yeah.
If they're too young to do research in manuscripts, and maybe you don't even have the time themselves, bring them in and get them a tour of the museum. And I don't mind at all, even if somebody's not going to use the archives and library, saying, hey, I'll give you a quick 2-minute tour.
Right.
This side's like a library, and this side is manuscripts. We've got everything from sports history to military history to club history to et cetera. And at a minimum, make them aware that it's here. Mm-hmm. Make them aware that it's here. So if you want to commit to a membership, that's great. If over and above that you can make a donation, that's wonderful. But also find a way to make your kids at least aware.
Right.
Bring them in, once and show them, so that it's here. Because that way you're making an investment in the future, and
Right.
in many ways that's just as important.
I agree.
One of the things that has always interested me is why are people not interested in old things in history? Because it was something that came to me naturally, and I don't know where it came from.
Right.
And I'm not even sure myself, except that when I see an old piece and I know approximately when it came from, I have always had a good imagination.
Right.
So it's easy for me to think of the people and what they're wearing and how they would have used it and why they would have made it and all of that. So all of that kind of background just floods into my brain when even as a kid, when I picked up something old and I saw the wear on it, and by looking at books I could figure out about how old it was.
Right.
where does that interest come from? And people, and it makes the world go round, but people have different interests. And it's healthy for people to have all kinds of different interests. And I've noticed in any group, a bus of school children that would come in where I worked before, to Landis Valley, there might be a few kids there that just aren't interested at all. The bulk of them would have some level of interest. And then there are going to be a few where it's hard to tear them away from even asking questions.
Right. Yeah.
So, and that's the way it is. And those ones are going to be the future archivists and curators and conservators and the public history people who are going to preserve and interpret it for the greater mass of people, who then might want to come and pick certain things out of it or access the information.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I've done a couple presentations for kids. Usually my presentations are for adults, but adults have kind of learned to tamp down their excitement. But the ones I've done with kids, the kids that are sitting in the front row and are so excited and want to tell you about their house, and they're the ones that make it fun. So, is there anything that we didn't cover that maybe you thought about as we were talking that you want to mention before we wrap up?
I don't think so. Okay. It might be of interest, just one or two of when I was in preservation. One of the things that was really memorable, I got to, when Independence Hall was fully scaffolded, I was part of the team. I was actually, at that point, I was the architectural preservation reviewer appointed by the State Historic Preservation Office to go down and meet with the structural engineers, the architects, and the city's own preservation people. Anyway, when that building was fully scaffolded for repairs all the way to the top of the spire, I got to climb that scaffolding and get all the way to the top of that, which was kind of it was a scary experience, but it was a once in a lifetime thing to be scaling that building and go, all the way up there. And then get
to see,
and really put your hand on the top of the spire and on the, so that was a really memorable thing. And just some of the people that you meet along the way, whether it was working with artifacts or working with buildings, some great people. And oftentimes, and I've never been really good with faces and names. I'm just I might spend some time with somebody and then see them in the crowd and think, oh, is that person? Is that them?
Why did they
is
look?
It not? And what was their name? But I've always said, if you're an artifact, I'll remember you forever, because people would bring in some really neat things with some really neat stories. And I would just remember them forever, and I would know once I had cleaned and cataloged and that artifact and put it on a shelf, I would always know where it was. In amongst 100,000 things, I could go to that shelf and say, I know where that is.
Yes. That's a great memory. Well, how can someone contact you or contact the Historical Society?
I get quite a bit of email. I guess a lot of people do it that way. People will still send things in through the mail.
Okay.
There are 2 email addresses for the Historical Society, and one starts out office.
Okay.
And that goes directly to our office manager, and the one that starts out archive, the word archive, goes directly to me.
Okay. Very good. And then if someone's starting their research, should they reach out to the office first, do you think? Is that the best? Or does it not matter?
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
I should add, it's important to add that when I said we get a lot of requests from outside of Pennsylvania, the way that we handle those, and it's the way that all of the historical societies and
Right.
repositories do basically, is that we need to charge for that research time. I would say of the half a dozen to 10 prepaid research requests that came in, and I had a summer backlog of dozens and dozens of requests. But of the ones that were prepaid, I mean, I had one from Washington State, and one from Oregon, and one from Arizona, and one from Illinois, and I could go on naming other states in the Union.
Right.
And one was in Pennsylvania, and it was from Chambersburg. But the way that we handle the requests for somebody who cannot come in and do the research is that we will do research for $25 an hour.
Okay.
And we will give you an estimate beforehand. So if you were to send an email either to the office email address or to mine, and say, I'm researching my great-great-grandfather or mother who had this following name, and I think this is about when they were born, and I think this is what religious affiliation they were, and I think this is their church. Can you find out for me all that you can about this? Then we would take a look at it, and knowing what kinds of records we have, we would say, well, records are scanty on this sort of thing, and we'll probably find out all that we can in an hour.
Right, right.
Or if we say, we've got only one manuscript that deals with this, and I can go and check it in 10 minutes and tell you whether it's of use or not.
Right.
If we can go and check something in 5 or 10 minutes, we don't charge somebody for that. But if we have to go through 5, 6, 10 different sets of records and hunt, because there are so many people that are writing in with requests and all that, to put them in the queue in order, and to pay for copier paper, and run the dehumidifiers and everything else.
Oh, yes,
pay all those bills and stuff.
Well, and they need to pay for your time too.
And pay for our time and our own. There are only 2 of us here now. Help pay the salaries and everything. We do charge, but we will give you an estimate. We will take a look at that and say, well, gee, that's gonna, that's a good 2 hours worth of work. Is it worth $50 to you?
Right.
And sometimes people then will refine their search and say, well, I'm really only interested about this individual.
Right.
Or they might refine it somewhat. But there are those people that will say, will send in $60 or $100 and say, please give this, I want all that you can find out about them.
Yeah.
And then we will, in that case, include the cost of copies. If we're copying some church records.
Okay,
or we're
and then
copying.
mailing it. Yeah, I was thinking you could frame it as cheaper than a plane ticket.
I have a guy who's coming in tomorrow who's landing at all I know is he's landing at the BWI airport.
Yes.
And he's gonna stay in York.
Oh, yes.
And I'm not sure what state he's coming in from.
Oh,
but
that'll be
he's
interesting. Yeah.
And then also in this time of COVID, what we're trying to do, I don't know how much longer we will do this, but presently the front door actually is locked so that we can control the population in here. And I'm asking people, if at all possible, try and make appointments with us.
It makes sense.
We don't have a big research room in there, and it doesn't usually get crowded, but it has on occasion gotten crowded. And if you have 5 different researchers in there, or if you have 4 different couples in there,
it can get busy.
It can get crowded, and we don't have the room in there to really socially distance people.
Yeah.
So that's why at this point I'm trying not to have 2 researchers at the same time. So if we can split up the day, and if somebody has a fairly short thing, if they can and they're coming in the morning, then we can say, okay, yeah, if somebody calls, yeah, can you come in the afternoon? Fine, otherwise we're trying to space them each to a day where we
Right,
can.
yeah, yeah,
this
and that makes sense from a safety standpoint, and hopefully it won't get terrible this fall, and we'll try to get back to normal somewhat. So okay, well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. I feel like I learned a lot, and I want to take some pictures so we can post them on the website too.
Yeah, good. We'd like to see people in here that
Yes.
want to
Yes.
want to come in and use the resources.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Practical Preservation Podcast. The resources discussed during this episode are on our website at practicalpreservationservices.com/podcast. If you received value from this episode and know someone else that will get value from it as well, please share it with them. Join us next week for another episode of the Practical Preservation Podcast. For more information on restoring your historic home, visit practicalpreservationservices.com.